Good morning and welcome to the Point. A lot has transpired in the 2 weeks that we took off over the holidays, so we'll try to get you up to speed this morning. First of all, Donald Trump is putting the final touches on putting his administration together. He has already made announcements about most of the people that he wants in his cabinet, and now the hearings are starting for them on Capitol Hill. The idea is to have many of them ready for a confirmation vote by the entire Senate as soon as he takes office in just under 2 weeks. However, that could be slowed down by Democrats. We'll be in Washington next week as Betsy DeVos from West Michigan will have her hearing in front of the Education Committee. Next week here on this show, we'll report on that and also get a view from Washington from a number of our elected officials. In the meantime, back here in Michigan, there are a number of new lawmakers who are taking office in Lansing, and this morning we're going to continue to introduce you to some of them, starting with Scott Van Single. He will be taking over in the 100th district, which is Lake, Oceana, and Newaygo County, and he replaces fellow Republican John Bumstead. Let's talk about what you want to do in Lansing, because you've got a three-county area that largely rural, and you have a lot of agriculture concerns. I'm sure you have a lot of economic and employment concerns. What do you want to do in Lansing to help your district?
The main thing is we're at almost 100% employment in our district, and so there's actually labor shortages when you look at the agriculture industry. So we need to find ways to work with the federal government to supply a steady force of workers, and a lot of those are coming from out of the country. It would be nice if we could use local labor, but it just hasn't worked that way in the past for the last really generation or more. So I know we don't set immigration laws at the state level, but there are ways we can work with the federal government, specifically the H-2A program, to have a steady flow of workers that we know who we are, they're screened, and they're here to work. And there's a national security interest there, but also it's beneficial to our economy. So getting workers is number one.
How do you approach your time in Lansing, understanding that everybody has got at best 6 years to serve over in the House, short time to accomplish the things you want to do? You've identified one of the things. What are the larger state issues that you're interested in?
Yeah, a lot of it's keeping the budget on track. We've had a history of, especially because of the term limit issue, of being very short-sighted and saying September 30th we have to have the budget done, so about 10 p.m. on September 30th we're going to have something done. We don't know what it is, but it's going to be somewhat balanced, and we'll let the next team figure out, the consequences of that. We need to keep on the track that we've been on, where we have our budgets done by May. There's long-term solutions in there, and a lot of that goes into the pension programs. That you can underfund these pension programs and appear that you have a balanced budget, and kick the can down the road for someone else to deal with. So I think we need to have a long-term view on the budget as a whole, and have it done in a timely manner. And this helps everybody, especially our school districts that have a budget to work with going into the fall, rather than just not knowing what it's going to be come September.
Well, yeah, and given the fact that schools have to have their budgets done in July, so if the state budget isn't done until September, now, and we should point out in the past 6 years it has been.
Right.
That's been a goal of this CPA governor, and so that's something that has been there. But one of the things that Democrats have been critical about is another budgetary promise, and that's the roads deal that was passed this past year. They say it's not enough, kicks in too late, and is not adequately funded going forward. Have you looked at the roads deal? Are you satisfied that that's going to meet the needs of what has to happen in the state, or are you and your legislative partners going to have to revisit that?
I'm sure this is not a done issue. They put an inflationary increase in there to avoid, it was supposed to avoid dealing with this in the future. I have a feeling this issue is going to come up again. But they did spend a lot of time going through the numbers, and the governor came up with a number, I believe it was about $1.2 billion, and that's what the package was for. So if he needed more, I would have thought they would have asked for a different number. So what I'm seeing in some of our rural districts or townships in my area is there's not the tax base. And so you'll look at the numbers, and it's still just, it's $300,000 per mile to completely resurface a road, and they're getting an increase of $30,000 in their budget. So they can do 1/10 of 1 mile of a road. They're still going to have some major problems. In some of the areas in the southern part of my district where there's a better tax base, the roads are good. They have the tax base to locally fund some of the projects. So it's still some of those outlying areas I believe are going to struggle in the near future.
What is your take on Lansing and the way government works? You talked about a problem that you identified that was getting budgets done late. As we said, in the past 6 years, that really hasn't been an issue.
Yeah.
What do you look at in terms of the change, if any, that you and your freshman colleagues can bring to Lansing?
Yeah, well, one of the positive things I see is a fairly young group of men and women coming in that have business backgrounds that aren't in the philosophical world. They're grounded in reality. They've put together budgets, made payrolls, and I believe they're going to be an asset when it comes to state government, that they're going to use a lot of those skills to come up with a budget just on a lot bigger scale. And again, I think we're going to continue seeing this done in a timely manner as we have in the last few years.
When you talk about that kind of cooperation, I assume you're talking about bipartisan cooperation, and when you say you don't come from a philosophical background, you talk about the ideological background that so often we see exhibited. Which brings me to a conversation I have with every freshman member that ever sits at this table, and they're going to go to Lansing and they're going to be nonpartisan. Now, I take each one of them at their word. Mm-hmm. However, over the past 20 years, that hasn't necessarily played out to be the case. How do you enforce that? How do you enforce it within yourself, and how do you help your colleagues if that's the goal?
Well, one of the things that I have really had to watch myself doing during this campaign is not making these hyper-partisan statements, not going out on the campaign trail and saying Hillary for prison, or making these inflammatory statements that play to your base but really alienate the other half of the party. So I've really tried to be just a fact-based, rational candidate, and I want to bring that to Lansing and build personal relationships with the other people on the other side of the aisle. And I have gotten to know some of them, and you know what? They're good people just like us. They may have different views on the role of government or what should be in the state budget. That doesn't make them bad people. So I, as one person, will do my best to work across the aisle, but a lot of it's holding your leadership accountable too. We elect our party leadership. If they're hyper-partisan and refuse to get along with the other party, they're accountable to us as the part of their caucus.
Many of the new representatives in Lansing are taking over because the person who represented that district previously was term limited. That was the case for Representative Van Sinkle, as it is for Representative James Lauer. He takes over for the term limited Rick Outman in the 70th district, which is Montcalm and part of Gratiot County. The election's passed, you're headed to Lansing, so tell me what it is that you want to do for Montcalm, part of Gratiot County that you cover. What is it that you think your district needs, and what can you do to help that in Lansing?
Yeah, you know, the last time we were on, we talked a lot about skilled trades training and that issue, and I was really excited. Speaker Leonard mentioned that as one of his top priorities, and in talking with my colleagues that I'm coming in with, it's a top priority for a lot of the freshmen, and I think a lot of the people that are there. So I think if we can get that issue addressed, that'd make a huge difference for my district.
And when you talk about your district, obviously there have been job losses there from factories that have closed and other issues. While the economy has recovered to some degree for most of the state, parts of the state haven't recovered as much, and you think skilled trades would be one of the keys to that. For example, I assume through something like Montcalm Community College.
Right, yeah, we talked about that a little bit when I was on before, and a partnership with them to make sure that people graduating from high school or 2 years of college have skills that are relevant to employers. That's probably the biggest problem we're having, is there's actually jobs available right now that are going unfilled because we're not training people with the right skills. So if we can address that, matching up the workforce with the jobs that are actually available, that would be a huge benefit. But also creating more jobs would still be good too.
When you think about that in terms of implementation, obviously every idea usually has to come with a price tag. But the governor too has been talking about this for a number of years, so it seems like there may be some agreement. Do you have any idea what kind of cost you're talking about?
I'm thinking of a shift in the curriculum to allow for more flexibility, and I think it would actually save taxpayers money by doing some of this in in high school instead of having people go to college. So I'm not sure on the price tag, but if we could realign the curriculum to allow the flexibility where kids are getting these skills at the high school level rather than in college, I think that's going to be a net savings right there. So I'm basically using the dollars we already have for a different purpose is what I have in mind.
Kind of back to the future. 40 years ago, that's exactly what you saw in high school.
Exactly.
A lot of trades training and that kind of thing. So going back to that kind of
right, and that's what I talked about a lot, when I was campaigning, knocking on doors and talking at different events in the community, and people agreed with that. They're like, that's what we definitely need to do. For the last 10, 15 years, it's been too much of a focus on everyone's got to go and get a 4-year degree or something like that. And the problem is a lot of people do go out and get that degree, and then there's not a job for them. I think we need to do a better job of training them while they're in high school for the jobs that we do have available.
Well, there is obviously one identified priority, but there are certainly a lot of other things you're going to have to deal with in Lansing. You've been through the orientation, you met some of your colleagues, the folks you'll be serving with in January. What else is it in Lansing that needs to be done, either specifically for your district or for government and the state in general?
Okay, so two things. I want to talk about health care a little bit. Obviously, with Donald Trump being elected president and the Republicans have the majority in the U.S. Senate, U.S. House, and at the state level, we're going to have real opportunity to go and redo the Affordable Care Act, and I think that's going to have a dramatic impact on Healthy Michigan and those kinds of things. So I'm working on a bill right now. We don't know what the specifics of the Trump plan is going to be, but I think we have to be ready to hit the ground running with that if he does get that done in the first 100 days. So if he's block granting the Medicaid dollars to the state, I think that's a real opportunity for us to, inject some free market principles, into healthcare. What I think is crazy is there's no price on what you get done at a hospital or when you go to the doctor. It all depends on what type of coverage, what type of insurance you have. That's a big change that he's talking about and I think needs to be made where if we can establish some prices, then we can inject some competition and hopefully lower costs. Because health insurance is not health care. We've been talking about health insurance as if it is health care, but it's not. Health care is health care. So that's what we need to focus on is trying to bring the actual cost down instead of providing people with coverage. But
one of the things you talk about is a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate in Washington. But as you are well aware, that majority in the Senate is so thin that there are not 60 votes. And so it is quite possible that Democrats could flex their muscle in the Senate and make any type of change to the Affordable Care Act very, very difficult, in which case there wouldn't be a lot of latitude for you at the state level, would there?
Right. But if you look at the last election, I think one of the biggest issues, at least that I heard from my district, is the exploding cost of health care. So if the people in the U.S. Senate don't want to go along with that, I think that'd be really disappointing because that's what people want. I mean, if I heard that all the time going door to door, hey, the cost of my Medigap policy has just doubled or tripled, or the cost of my health insurance, hey, we thought this was going to be affordable, and it's not. So if they don't go along with that, I'll be deeply disappointed. But to go back, you asked about another priority for me, and one more specific to my district and some rural counties is the fact that we just haven't had enough funding for police. You've probably seen in Montcalm County they recently had to lay off quite a few police officers, and I'm drafting a bill right now and meeting with some other colleagues that are going to be coming in to address that issue. So I'm hoping we can get that done as well.
Well, part of the problem, too, that counties, townships, and others would point to is that the revenue sharing that had once been put back into some of those entities is pretty well non-existent for most of them. So in addition to that, and in Montcalm County, the question was a little different, too. It wasn't just about state funding coming in.
Right.
It was about other allocations of dollars and cents. So I know you're in the drafting stage. What does that look like? Are you talking about putting more state money and more resources in?
What I'd like to see is a grant program that's specifically targeted to rural counties that are going through these budget difficulties, where then they can apply for state level funding, which would fund some positions for some additional deputies. I think that's going to be pretty popular in talking with a lot of people around Lansing, and they're seeing the same things in their districts. I think it seems to be, if you're in the 80,000 population range or lower as far as counties go, it seems like it's been hit particularly hard from a funding standpoint. So I'm talking with reps that are representing counties similar to that, and they said, hey, that'd be a great bill. We'd be interested in that. So that's something I'm working on right now.
When newly elected legislators sit down here with me, they almost always say they're looking forward to working across the aisle with their colleagues that are Republicans or Democrats, whichever party they are not. And in many cases, there are bipartisan activities that take place. But on the big issues, when it comes to funding things, when it comes to paying for the big ticket items, it's kind of hard to find that bipartisan agreement sometimes. We're going to see part of that in lame duck, I suspect, as well. When you were there for orientation, when you were meeting your colleagues, when you were talking to folks, what is your take on the way you think Lansing could work?
I think it's going to work really well. The orientation was bipartisan, as you know. It was for Republicans and for Democrats. And as you know, on most of the issues, it's 110-0, 108-2. It's the big ticket items that you talked about that generally tend to be, you know, more controversial or maybe less bipartisan. But I think what the people said on the 8th of November is that they want to see us work together and they want to see us get things done. I think that goes for my Republican colleagues and Democrat colleagues as well.
What do you think you can take to Lansing that will make that process better?
I think just my experience, my background, we talked about it before, having been a city manager, having been a county commissioner, having worked for both the House and the Senate. I have a lot of relationships already, and I think that is the key thing, is building relationships, whether it's with other Republicans or Democrats or with people in the Senate. That's what you got to have to get things done. So I think that's what I bring to the table more than anything, is an established base of relationships that I can then build upon to be effective for my district.
When we come back, another new member of the state legislature, and we'll talk about activities in Lansing that include the state of the state. Next, To the Point. Welcome back to The Point. In Lansing, the legislature prepares to get underway. One of the very first issues of business will be to look at the budget. That, of course, is always a big item in Lansing. One of the new members who will take a look at that for the first time is Jim Lilly. He's from Ottawa County and replaces Amanda Price in the 89th District. Talk a little bit about your motivation for running for this office, because this was an unusual election cycle. The seat that you will assume is generally decided in the primary, as was the case this year. But you go to Lansing in the majority. What is it that needs to be done for your district, and what do you do? Why did you run?
Sure. So obviously there's a couple questions in there, but I'll kind of start with why I ran. So, you know, for me, obviously, I think nobody really knew what the election cycle was going to look like kind of a year before, and so I made the decision more or less independent of that. But, you know, my wife and I are very committed to the state of Michigan. We really want to be able to stay here for the rest of our lives. And what we really saw was, you know, there's a lot of people that run for office that have, you know, a political background or a nonprofit background, but we just don't have a lot of people running with a business background. And we both believed that was something that was important. And so, you know, as a former banker and business leader, I felt that I had that skill set and wanted to bring that to Lansing. And so early on, you know, kind of looked at what the field would look like and, you know, really didn't see that skill set in any of the other competitors. And so it was something that I felt important and called to do at that time. So in terms of answering your question with respect to, you know, what are priorities for the district, one of the things I think is really interesting about the 89th District is that it's sort of a microcosm of Michigan's economy. And so, you know, you've got tourism, you've got agriculture, and then you've got manufacturing. And so really I'm going to Lansing trying to focus on how do we improve the environment and competitive environment for all three of those industries. And in doing that, you know, what I really find is what's good for the 89th District is also good for the rest of Michigan.
Well, it's interesting because you identify three areas. You have one of the busiest state parks in the state. In fact, I think the governor went there to sign some state park legislation in the past year. You have manufacturing that is specialty, boat and other type of things. And you also have specialty crops in agriculture out there. So those three focuses do touch on three of the strongest parts of Michigan economy. Let's talk about agriculture first, because that footprint gets smaller and smaller as the population gets bigger and bigger. What do you do to help to support that community?
So, you know, one of the things I'm really proud of, I received a lot of endorsements during the course of my campaign. And while endorsements are helpful during the campaign, they're also helpful as you sit down to govern. So I'll be looking towards the Michigan Farm Bureau and a lot of our local farmers to really direct, you know, what I can do to be helpful. But what I hear from these folks, sort of in general, is this theme of over-regulation. And so to the extent that we can make sure that and maybe it's not even about rolling regulation back, but just ensuring that going forward we don't have overly burdensome regulation imposed on some of these industries. So, you know, that's really one of the things, it was a theme during my campaign, it's something that I'll stay focused on, is just making sure that as we talk about the regulatory environment going forward, that we're thinking about common sense regulations and that anything new proposed sort of goes through the rigor of having to sit down with all those stakeholders and make sure it's going to work for everybody and that it's really going to be good for consumers in the end.
The question will not be answered on this show, and it likely will not be answered in the short term at all, but there have been critical reports, Mackinac Center for one, talking about Michigan tourism and the dollars the state spends to attract tourism. They say that their numbers and research conflict with what the state does. What is the role of the state when it comes to tourism? Because obviously there is a state tax base that can be supported by tourism that helps not just the state, but it helps private business owners too, and that kind of thing. Have you done any critical analysis of how that works? Because I know you're only getting started.
Right. But I'm a numbers guy too, so I imagine a lot of that's going to fall on me when I'm actually there. To answer your question, Rick, I've not really dove into the numbers at this point, but it is something I'm committed to doing once I take office. And what I would say about that too is, I'm the type of person that believes that the state certainly is going to have some role in economic development at some level. It's hard to sell a product if you don't have any salespeople out in the field. But I also think we have to, take a critical look at everything and all the money that we're spending in these departments and make sure that Michigan taxpayers are getting the value that they deserve for those dollars, because it's always a question of priorities in terms of where the dollars go. But I think it's some level of spending in those areas is probably warranted.
On some level, this will be remembered as a change election. Perhaps not a change between left and right as I described it when I was talking with the chairman of the Michigan Democratic Party. He said maybe a change between top and bottom. In the state of Michigan, though, not much changed. The Republicans keep to almost the same numbers. The House of Representatives, there were no state Senate races or races for governor. For the first time since 1988, by a relatively slim margin, the state did vote for a Republican presidential candidate, but I think it would be fair to say not a traditional Republican presidential candidate. My words, not yours. I think this election suggested that people are not particularly happy with government on any level. If that's the case, and if you accept that premise, what can you do? What can your freshman class do to, A, readjust government so it's working better for the people, and then make the people believe that it's working for them, because those may be two different things?
Sure. I think if I had the perfect answer to that question, I would really have the perfect,
you would have run for president.
I would have run for president. But, from my standpoint, Rick, I think what it comes down to, and you're right, I mean, people are sick of sort of the status quo in government. I've never been elected office before, so it's certainly a change of in the election for me, but in terms of what I'm looking at. But I think what it comes down to is it's really people just want to be heard. And that was something that I heard, during the course of my campaign as I was out having conversations with folks. I think people really just want to make sure that their voice is being heard in Lansing and in the district. And so that's what I'm committed to doing. I think that what we can really do if we want to be effective leaders is we can encourage our constituents to hold us accountable. And that happens by encouraging them to have conversations with us, by encouraging folks to show up to our office hours. I think that's really what people are going to, what people will feel will make the difference if after sitting down and having those conversations, they actually start to see action on some of those items from us out of our offices in Lansing.
You've been through orientation, and we don't know the full extent of lame duck yet, because as you and I sit here, it's not done. But with those two things established, what do you expect it to be like in January when you go in full time to take this on? Because you have never served, you've never worked in the legislature either.
Nope.
So this is a brand new foray for you. Geographically, it's not too hard. The Anderson building's there, the Capitol building's there, so those two things are pretty easy. But beyond that, through orientation and meeting with some of your colleagues, has anything surprised you yet?
So, obviously you sort of get surprised every day that you're there, but it's just really hard to know what things are going to look like when we get there in January, because what my priorities are or what the district's priorities might be, things really get shifted around depending on what legislature has been dealt with or what hasn't been dealt with yet. And so whether energy or insurance or what's going to be kind of top on the agenda, it's all going to get determined, I think, by what more or less happens over the next couple weeks. So there's not a lot of surprises that I've seen so far in terms of the job and what to expect, but I've also not seen a lot yet. So in that respect, we'll have to see.
We're back with a final thought next. To the point. Next week, the view from Capitol Hill, and we'll talk about the state of the state, all to the point.